In this video, I want to share with you three things that has transformed my life as a Christian, no longer bound to fear, obligation, and duty to lay down my life in service to God. Yes, it is a privilege to serve God, but without these three things, what started off as a privilege quickly becomes a burden that you and I were never meant to carry. And if you stick around to the end, I'll show you how this burden has come about in Christian culture and how easy it is to just step out of it. Hey, my name is Zephaniah, and welcome to Rule and Reign, a conversational journey of what it looks like for us to walk in governance, live in dominion, to rule and reign in every single area of our life. If you could take away anything from this video, I pray it will be this one thought that you and I were created from His delight for the purpose of His delight. I'll say it again this way. You and I were created from God's delight for the purpose of His delight. You know, they say that Christianity was never supposed to be a religion, but always about a relationship. In fact, you hear it in church where you hear things like religion is man's way to get to God, but relationship is God's way to get to man. In other words, I could say it this way, that religion is a whole lot of doing to get more of God or to get to God, and serving is a whole lot of way in order to impress God. But relationship is a whole lot of being because of what God has already done. Therefore, Christianity was never supposed to be about serving or self-sacrifice or laying down your life, but it was always supposed to be about the place of delight, the birthplace of everything about you, the birthplace of your existence in God. And when we lose the light, we start to enter into fear-based Christianity, where we begin to operate from obligation and duty and expectation and begin to perform for what has already been given to us from God. And that becomes really, really tiring and really exhausting. In 2025, God spoke to me something quite clearly that has now shifted the trajectory and the direction of my life and our family. But prior to this, I grew up in church, grew up in ministry. My parents were in ministry. My dad was a worship pastor. My mom occasionally helped out in children's ministry. But then my parents separated, and then this caused great trauma in my life and created a massive void in my life that I tried to fill with a whole lot of performance. So I simply followed the path that was right in front of me. I never chose it. It was right in front of me. I just followed. I just, stayed in church, stepped into ministry, served, and then led, and then preached, and I became really good at it. But it wasn't necessarily something that I wanted to give my life to. But somehow I believed that I was just being obedient. I thought that I just served because this is what Christians do. But on the inside, I never felt worthy and never felt the freedom of a son. Instead, I performed for love, performed for acceptance, performed for approval and validation, especially when it came to leadership around me. And so, and by the way, leaders were not bad. They were not the issue. The issue was my immaturity and my lack of freedom as a son. I unknowingly put my leaders and those whom God put around me for my development in the place where only God could operate from. And so if my leaders were unhappy, then God was somehow unhappy. If my leaders were disappointed for whatever the reason it was, if they were disappointed, then God was disappointed. If my leaders had some questions regarding some stuff in my life that they just wanted some understanding in, somehow God was now drilling me for whatever that is. And my relationship with God was driven by fear and not necessarily reverence. So on the outward appearance, it looked healthy, looked happy, looked successful, but internally I was miserable, absolutely miserable. So I guess turning point for me happened at one point when I was away on holiday after a big season of a whole lot of doing. My family and I went away on holiday thanks to my in-laws. We went away for 10 days to the island of Rarotonga. And 10 days of absolutely doing nothing but a whole lot of fun, rest, and enjoyment. And that's when I realized, man, I actually really hate my life. I really hate my life, and I didn't want to go back. And then I started to condemn myself for the way I was feeling about, about serving God and about the environment I was in. And the environment I was in wasn't bad. It was simply that God was beginning to unravel some things from within inside of me. And during that time when I was away on holiday, I went on this amazing bike ride around the whole island of Rarotonga. It takes about 45 minutes to an hour to ride around the whole island. And it was a dream of mine to have a motorbike or a moped and just ride. And as I was having fun, I literally felt like God was on the back seat and behind me. And at the end of this ride, I heard God say something to me that has transformed my life. And I never heard him say this to me before. And he said to me, son, that's how it's always supposed to be. I don't want control of your life. I want partnership. Everything I've heard growing up as a Christian was give God control of your life. And yet here is God saying to me, I don't want control. I just want to be partners. And looking back, I now realize that this was him permissioning me out of this reality that I existed in the season I was in, and this thing that I was doing, thinking I was pleasing him, but really I was just performing. I was just doing a whole lot of performance. Flying back to New Zealand from holiday, as we flew over the landscape of New Zealand, I looked over the window and I saw the landscape, and I began to have some anxiety and have a whole lot of dread about going back into this reality that I was in. And once again, I heard God speak to me as clear as day for the second time during the holiday, something that I've never heard him say before. He said, son, I don't want your surrender. I want your delight. Now I'm hearing two things that I've never really heard in Christian culture, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to us because God wants us to know him for him beyond what we've been taught in Christian culture. Okay. When God wants you to know him, he would invite you out for you to know him for who he is and not merely through the lenses of the culture that is talking about him. So at the time, my understanding of surrender meant dying to myself and giving myself to the ministry, where I somehow believed that the more miserable I am, the more it honors God. I knew that as a whole lot of rubbish. I knew that. But I don't know how, but somehow there was so deep in my subconscious that the more I die to myself, the more it honors God. And the problem, now this makes ministry sound really bad, but the problem wasn't ministry. The problem was my broken view of who God was. So I find myself now sitting in my pastor's office, and being the incredible man that he was, he could see some stuff was going on inside me, and being the awesome man that he was, sat me down and asked, Zeph, are you okay? Do you want to stop doing this? Do you want to put this down? And I couldn't bring myself to say yes because I was petrified. I was so scared of disappointing God and disappointing him and disappointing my leaders. I was somehow convinced that this was the only will of God for my life, even though I was miserable. And I could not bring myself to say yes because I was so scared to disappoint God and so scared to find myself out of. I heard in Christianity that the perfect place for you to be is right in the middle of God's will for your life. And at that time, I somehow got to the point of somehow thinking that this was the only will of God for my life, even though I was miserable, miserable. I was not experiencing delight at all. And so I was scared to disappoint God and scared to disappoint my pastors. And so a lot has happened for me since then to get me to this point where I felt the freedom of now operating as a son. In fact, piece by piece, people say, you're on a journey, you're on a process, but the reality is journey looks like going from point A to point B to point C. But for me, it was a process. It was like a tangled up piece of string. God had to untangle this massive piece of string so that it's one long piece of string so that it can flow. And that was what God was doing for me. It was just a whole lot of entanglement. And it took time, piece by piece, layer by layer, of one encounter after another. Finally, in 2025, at the very beginning, in fact, it was New Year's Day, I was sick in bed, and God woke me up, and I heard him as clear as day for the third time throughout this whole experience. And I heard him say, it's time for you to come out from under your father's house. And I knew then exactly what he was saying. It wasn't an instruction, it was an invitation. He was inviting me out from under the covering I existed under and the system I operated in for him to now father me alone and show me a whole new reality that I never had experienced before. It's time for you to come out from under your father's house. So here are three things that I learned from that season that have now transformed my life. Number one, your view of who the Father is. I've said this many times before, that your view, your perception, your perspective of who God is the most important thing about you, because it informs everything about you. In fact, it informs every decision you make, every perspective you have, and every way you operate. Like, the way I saw God at the time was that he was distant and he was unavailable, and so every decision I made was to be pleasing to him. But I never knew that I was already pleasing to him. Yeah, the way I saw God at the time was someone that needed me to serve. That this was the way to operate inside of His good graces, was for me to serve Him, was for me to please Him, was for me to do stuff for Him, was to continue on this rat race of Christianity, this hamster wheel, in order to please Him. But I never realized that He was already pleasing to me. I was already pleasing to Him, and so if you look at God as someone who constantly needs to be pleased, someone who constantly needs to be served, someone who is unavailable and is distant, then you will live your life that way, and it is absolutely miserable. But when you get to the point in your walk with God where you begin to see God as a father for who He really is, and it is God who does this to you, when you begin to see Him as a father, then everything about you changes. Life will never be the same. Where you will start to feel the freedom of what it means to be a son. You never have to do the things you do to please God or to serve God, because you realize you don't have to do that anymore. You now live in complete bliss, the complete freedom. You get to live life the way you want to, in partnership with your Father in heaven. Number two, leaders are important, but they are not God. I want to say this respectfully, but pastors, leaders, spiritual covering are all important, but they are not God. And I want to portion this because I know that there are men watching who are new on their journey of faith, who rely on the covering and the mentorship of those around them as the counsel of God in their life. I want to say that is important. And, that was part of my development as a son. But at some point in your life, God begins to invite you out for you to know Him for who He is, beyond the culture around you. And I want to say that true humility is simply you agreeing with what God says beyond what the environment has taught you, right? Romans 12 says, do not be conformed by the pattern of this world or the culture around you, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Eventually, God wants to invite you out as a son, for you to know Him as your Father, for you to be exclusively defined by Him and Him alone, and not by the culture of Christianity around you. Number three, this was always supposed to be about relationship. If your relationship with God feels one way, one-sided, where you're constantly having to do more to get to Him, constantly have to do more in order to please Him, then this is no longer a relationship, and that sucks. And you're no longer experiencing the main point, which is delight. Remember, you and I were created from His delight for the sole purpose of His delight. This is where it all comes from, is delight. Now, I want to tell you the problem. Now, I want to give you the promise I had, if you're getting where this whole thing of burden comes from. And look, if your existence in God is centered around the cross, okay, then you'll constantly be sin conscious and sacrifice conscious. Now, please hear my heart. I'm not trying to diminish what was done at the cross. The power of the cross, what Jesus did. But if your existence in God is centered around the cross, then you'll constantly be sin conscious and sacrifice conscious of what Jesus did to lay down His life. What Jesus did was the extreme revelation of the Father's love to restore you back to your original intent, back to divine design, was to live from the garden, the place of intimacy, the place of oneness, the place of union, the place of delight, where that is the launch pad of everything that you are as a son in His eyes. That's the place where you're meant to operate from. That's the place where you're meant to dream from. That's the place where you're meant to commune from. That's the place where you're meant to live from as a Christian man, as a son, as a king on the earth. The place of delight. You were created from his delight for the sole purpose of his delight. And the purpose of the cross was the extreme revealing of God's love to restore you back to this place where you are one with the Father. I want to tell you, in fact, if this has resonated with you, I have the privilege of leading so many men through the place, I think, called Masters of the Code, where I've led men to discover the dream God has put on their hearts. And the freedom that has come over their lives because of this experience is next to none. They've now transformed not only their lives, but the lives of their own family. And when you get to this place where you realize that you are already pleasing to your Father and you have absolute freedom in the Father's eyes to now begin to dream with him, life looks absolutely different from trying to do something to please God and to get more of God and to further along your relationship with God. You know, one thing I really hated, I hated hearing in Christian circles was, how hungry are you for God? How hungry are you for God? And it always felt like no matter how hungry I try to be, I'm always further away from being, from pleasing God with my hunger. And hunger looked like doing more, being more, serving more. And it was just tiring. But I got to this point where I realized that I'm already a son and I'm already pleasing to him. And that took time of discovering God and testing the boundaries and going against everything that I've been taught. And this is what I mean when God begins to invite you out for you to know him as a father, for you to be exclusively defined by him alone and not by the culture around you. It will transform your life. And that's what Master the Code did for me. When I began to learn how to dream with God, it was a whole new experience of my reality. It was a whole new experience of Christianity, a whole new experience of freedom in him. And I want that for you. This is Rule and Reign. Like I said always before, if something of this has resonated with you, drop me a comment, like this, send this to someone whom you think this might be of value to or resonate with. Drop me a comment. Love to connect with those on the journey with me. But this is Rule and Reign, a conversational journey of what it looks like for you and I to walk in governance, live in dominion, to rule and reign in every single area of our life. Remember, you and I were created from his delight for the sole purpose of his delight. May it bless you. See you guys in the next one. Best.